Venezuela targeted the wrong ship, a U.S. Navy nightmare for them. Let me take you back to the evening of January 29, 2025. The Caribbean Sea, usually a theater of cruise liners and commercial shipping, became the stage for something far more dangerous. A Venezuelan patrol boat, the Guaycaipuro, intercepted a vessel near the maritime boundary of Trinidad and Tobago. The ship in question? Not some random tanker or fishing trawler, but the USNS Robert E. Peary, a U.S. Navy logistics vessel operating under the Military Sealift Command. The Venezuelans boarded it, detained the crew, and, according to their government, found suspicious military equipment on board. Within hours, Caracas declared this an act of defensive sovereignty against American aggression. The U.S. State Department called it piracy. The media ran with the story for a day or two, framing it as another example of Venezuela's reckless provocation, before moving on to the next crisis. But here's what they're not telling: this wasn't just another diplomatic spat. This was a miscalculation of historic proportions, one that could drag the United States into a conflict it doesn't want, doesn't need, and isn't prepared to win. And if you think this is just about Venezuela, you're missing the bigger picture. What happened that night in the Caribbean is a microcosm of America's broader strategic overreach, its inability to accept a multipolar world, and the dangerous game of brinkmanship being played by great powers in the shadows. I've spent the last 3 decades studying these kinds of incidents, how they escalate, how they're exploited, and how they can spiral into something far worse than anyone intended. And let me tell you, this one has all the hallmarks of a crisis that could define the next decade of U.S. foreign policy. So let's break it down, piece by piece, because what you've been told about this incident is only half the story. The official what they want you to believe. According to the U.S. government, the USNS Robert E. Peary was conducting routine operations in international waters when it was illegally boarded by Venezuelan forces. The Pentagon insists the ship was unarmed, carrying only humanitarian supplies and non-lethal equipment for regional partners. The State Department condemned the seizure as a flagrant violation of international law, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called it an act of state-sponsored piracy. The media, predictably, ran with the rogue regime angle. CNN described it as another example of Maduro's desperation, while Fox News framed it as proof that socialism always leads to aggression. Even the usually measured The Economist ran a piece titled "Venezuela's Dangerous Game of Chicken with the U.S." The Venezuelan side, of course, tells a different story. President Nicolas Maduro claimed the ship was operating inside Venezuelan waters and was carrying advanced surveillance equipment intended to support opposition groups. The Venezuelan military released grainy footage of what they said were electronic warfare modules and drones with military-grade cameras. They accused the U.S. of using humanitarian missions as cover for espionage, a tactic, they argued, that Washington has employed for decades in Latin America. Now, on the surface, this looks like a straightforward case of a weak, isolated regime lashing out at a superpower. The U.S. has sanctions on Venezuela, an oil embargo, and a history of supporting opposition figures. Maduro is unpopular, his economy is in shambles, and he's facing pressure from both domestic opponents and external actors like Colombia and Brazil. So why wouldn't he pick a fight with the U.S.? It plays well with his base, distracts from his failures, and reinforces his narrative of standing up to imperialism. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Deconstructing the what really happened. First, let's talk about the USNS Robert E. Peary. The U.S. insists it was an unarmed logistics vessel. That's technically true, it wasn't carrying missiles or fighter jets. But here's what they're not telling: the Peary is part of the Military Sealift Command's Surge Sealift Fleet, a program designed to rapidly deploy military equipment in a crisis. And while it may not have had weapons on board, it was carrying something far more secure: communications gear, satellite uplinks, and modular command and control systems, the kind of equipment used to coordinate special operations, drone strikes, and electronic warfare. Now, why would the U.S. be moving this kind of hardware through the Caribbean? Officially, it was part of a routine rotation for U.S. Southern Command. But here's the Peary wasn't heading to any U.S. base. Its last known port of call was Trinidad and Tobago, a country that has been quietly deepening its military cooperation with the U.S. in recent years. In 2023, Trinidad's government signed a status of forces agreement with Washington, allowing U.S. troops to operate on its soil. And just last month, the U.S. announced plans to establish a new drone surveillance hub in Trinidad to monitor drug trafficking and regional threats. So let's connect the dots. The U.S. is setting up a forward operating base in Trinidad, a country that shares a maritime border with Venezuela. It's moving sensitive military equipment through the region. And then, suddenly, a Venezuelan patrol boat intercepts one of these ships. Coincidence? Maybe. But in geopolitics, coincidences are rare. Here's what I think: really, Venezuela knew the US was moving military assets through the area, and they decided to send a message. The problem? They picked the wrong ship. The USNS Robert E. Peary isn't just any vessel. It's a US Navy ship, even if it's technically a civilian crewed auxiliary. And under international law, boarding a US military vessel, even in disputed waters, is a red line. The last time something like this happened was in 1985, when the Soviet Union seized a US spy ship, the USS Pueblo, in what became a major Cold War crisis. The US doesn't take these kinds of provocations lightly. But here's where it gets interesting. The Venezuelans didn't just board the ship and let it go. They detained the crew, including 2 US Navy personnel, and seized the equipment. That's not just a provocation, that's an act of war in all but name. And the US response? So far, it's been surprisingly restrained. Why? Because this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about Russia and China. The exited geopolitical a new Cold War in the Caribbean. Let me be: Venezuela is not acting alone. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a coordinated strategy by America's adversaries to test US resolve, exert their influence, and most importantly, force the US to overcommit its resources. First, let's talk about Russia. Moscow has been deepening its ties with Venezuela for years. In 2019, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of support for Maduro. In 2020, it deployed mercenaries from the Wagner Group to protect Maduro's regime. And just last year, Russia and Venezuela signed a new military cooperation agreement, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. Now, why would Russia care about Venezuela? Because it's a pressure point. The US has spent the last 2 decades obsessed with the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Russia, meanwhile, has been quietly rebuilding its influence in America's backyard. And Venezuela is the perfect place to do it. It's close to the US, it has oil, and most importantly, it's a weak state that can be easily manipulated. But Russia isn't the only player here. China is also deeply involved. Beijing has been Venezuela's largest creditor for over a decade, loaning it $60 billion since 2007. In return, China has secured long-term oil contracts and access to Venezuela's rare earth minerals, critical for its tech industry. And just last month, China and Venezuela announced a new $5 billion investment deal, including infrastructure projects and, you guessed it, military cooperation. So let's put this together. The US is trying to contain China in the Pacific, Russia in Eastern Europe, and Iran in the Middle East. And now, suddenly, it's facing a 3-front challenge in its own hemisphere. Venezuela is the weakest link in this chain, but it's also the most dangerous because it's right on America's doorstep. This is the new Cold War, and the Caribbean is the new battleground. Military and strategic: why this could spiral out of control. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because if you think this is just a diplomatic spat, you're not paying attention. The US has 3 major military commands that would be involved in any conflict with. 1. US Southern Command, responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean. It has been dramatically underfunded for decades, but in the last 2 years, its budget has doubled. Why? Because the Pentagon knows this region is heating up. 2. U.S. Northern Command, responsible for homeland defense. If Venezuela or its allies were to launch a cyber attack, sabotage a U.S. port, or even attempt a missile strike, NORTHCOM would be the first to respond. 3. U.S. Cyber Command, because in 2025, war starts online. And if you think Venezuela is acting alone, you're not thinking about the Russian and Chinese hackers who would be more than happy to help. Now, let's talk about escalation. The US has a few options. Option 1: diplomatic pressure, sanctions, condemnations, maybe a naval blockade. This is the least risky option, but it's also the least effective. Venezuela has been under US sanctions for years, and it's still standing. Option 2: limited military strike, a Tomahawk missile strike on a Venezuelan military base, or a special forces raid to free the detained crew. This is highly risky. It could escalate into a full-blown conflict, and it would play right into Maduro's narrative of resisting US imperialism. Option 3: full-scale invasion. This is the nightmare scenario. The US hasn't fought a major war in Latin America since the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and that didn't go well. Venezuela has 150,000 active duty troops, a Russian-backed air defense system, and most importantly, a population that would resist a US invasion with guerrilla warfare. Now, here's the: none of these options are good. And that's the problem. The US is overstretched. It's fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, containing China in the Pacific, and dealing with crises in the Middle East. And now, suddenly, it's facing a new front in its own backyard. This is what I've been warning about. For America's global hegemony is unsustainable. The US can't be everywhere at once. And when it tries, it overcommits, overextends, and ultimately fails. The domestic political why this is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about politics. Because this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about elections, voter sentiment, and the 2026 midterms. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. On one hand, it can't afford to look weak. The Republican Party has been pounding the "America is weak" narrative for years, and any perceived capitulation to Venezuela would be political suicide. On the other hand, the US public is war-weary. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the last thing Americans want is another endless conflict. So what does the White House do? It walks a tightrope. It condemns Venezuela, imposes new sanctions, and maybe even authorizes a limited military response, just enough to look tough, but not enough to start a war. But here's the: Maduro knows this. He knows the US doesn't want a war. And he's betting that the US will blink first. This is where domestic politics come into play. If the US does nothing, the Republicans will hammer Biden for being weak. If the US strikes back, the Democrats will fracture, progressives will accuse Biden of warmongering, while moderates will demand a stronger response. And then there's Florida, a key swing state with a large Venezuelan exile community. If Biden doesn't act decisively, he risks losing Florida in 2024. If he acts too aggressively, he risks alienating the anti-war left. This is the perfect storm, a crisis that forces the US to choose between bad options, all while its adversaries watch and wait. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1: the US backs down. In this scenario, the US negotiates the release of the crew, imposes new sanctions, and maybe even offers Venezuela a face-saving exit. The Maduro regime declares victory, the US avoids a war, and the whole thing fades from the headlines. Why? It's because the US can't afford to look weak. If it backs down now, Russia and China will see it as a green light to push harder in other regions. And the Republican Party will destroy Biden for it. Scenario 2: limited escalation. This is the most likely outcome. The US strikes a Venezuelan military target, maybe a radar station, maybe a patrol boat. It frees the crew through a special forces raid. Venezuela retaliates with cyber attacks or sabotage, but stops short of all-out war. Why? It's because escalation is unpredictable. One miscalculation, one stray missile, one dead US soldier, and suddenly, we're in a full-blown conflict. Scenario 3: full-blown war. This is the worst-case scenario. The US invades Venezuela, topples Maduro, and installs a pro-US government. Russia and China respond by escalating elsewhere, maybe in Ukraine, maybe in Taiwan. The US finds itself fighting a two-front war, its economy strains under the cost, and public support collapses. Why? It's because Venezuela isn't Iraq. It's closer, more populous, and more strategically important. And unlike in 2003, the US doesn't have the global support it once did. Grand strategy: the death of American hegemony. Let's out for a second. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about the end of an era. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should be the global policeman, intervening wherever it sees fit to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights. And for a while, it worked. The U.S. won the Cold War, exited NATO, and dominated the global economy. But here's that world is gone. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is no longer willing to follow America's lead. And the U.S.? It's overstretched, divided, and financially exhausted. This is what I've been warning about. For America's grand strategy is unsustainable. The U.S. can't afford to be the world's policeman. It can't afford to fight endless wars. And it certainly can't afford to pick a fight with Venezuela, a country that, on its own, is no threat to U.S. security. But here's the U.S. doesn't have a choice. Because if it backs down now, if it allows Venezuela to humiliate it in its own backyard, then Russia and China will see it as a sign of weakness. And that's when the real trouble starts. This is the Thucydides trap, the idea that when a rising power challenges a dominant one, war becomes inevitable. And right now, the U.S. is sleepwalking into it. Alternatives: and what should the U.S. do instead? So what's the solution? How does the U.S. avoid a catastrophic war while still protecting its interests? Here's what I would do if I were advising the White. 1. Stop the provocations. The U.S. needs to stop moving military equipment through the Caribbean under the guise of humanitarian missions. It's needlessly provocative, and it gives Venezuela an excuse to escalate. 2. Engage in back-channel diplomacy. The U.S. and Venezuela hate each other, but that doesn't mean they can't talk. There are third parties, like Mexico, Brazil, or even the Vatican, that could mediate. 3. Offer a face-saving exit. The U.S. should publicly demand the release of the crew, but privately offer Venezuela a way out. Maybe a sanctions relief deal, maybe a promise to stop interfering in its internal affairs. 4. Prepare for the worst. The U.S. should quietly reinforce its bases in the region, but avoid any public escalation. It should also prepare for cyber attacks, because if this goes south, that's where the real battle will be fought. 5. Accept a multipolar world. This is the hardest pill to swallow. The United States has spent the last 3 decades acting as if it could unilaterally dictate the rules of the global order. But the world has changed, and the sooner Washington accepts that, the better. A multipolar world doesn't mean chaos, it means competition, negotiation, and, yes, even cooperation where interests align. The alternative is a slow-motion collapse into a new Cold War, one where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower but just another player in a crowded field. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader erosion of U.S. deterrence in Latin America, a region that, for all its problems, has been firmly within Washington's sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine. The fact that Venezuela, a country with a GDP smaller than that of Connecticut, felt emboldened to seize a U.S.-flagged vessel in international waters isn't just a diplomatic incident. It's a symptom of something far more: the perception that America's red lines are no longer enforceable. Let me explain why this matters. Deterrence isn't just about having the biggest military, it's about convincing your adversaries that crossing you will cost them more than they're willing to pay. For decades, the U.S. maintained that credibility through a combination of overwhelming force, economic leverage, and diplomatic pressure. But in recent years, that credibility has been steadily chipped away. Russia's invasion of Ukraine exposed the limits of U.S. military support when allies dragged their feet. China's action in the South China Sea showed that Washington's warnings could be ignored with impunity. And now, Venezuela's brazen act in the Caribbean is the latest data point in a disturbing the world is testing America's resolve, and so far, the U.S. hasn't given them a reason to stop. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. Navy is still the most powerful maritime force on the planet, but its ability to project power is being constrained by 2 things: political will and operational overstretch. The Navy's fleet is shrinking, its ships are aging, and its sailors are stretched thin. The USS Harry S. Truman, one of the U.S.'s 11 aircraft carriers, is currently undergoing maintenance in Norfolk. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most advanced carrier, is in the Mediterranean supporting NATO operations. That leaves the USS George Washington in the Pacific and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower in the Middle East. In other words, the US has no carrier strike group in the Atlantic right now, something that hasn't gone unnoticed in Moscow or Beijing. And that's just the surface fleet. Beneath the waves, the US submarine force is still dominant, but even that advantage is being challenged. Russia's Yazan-class submarines and China's Type 095 are closing the gap in stealth and firepower. Meanwhile, the US is struggling to build enough Virginia-class attack submarines to keep up with demand. The Navy's 2024 budget request included funding for just one new submarine, despite the fact that the US needs at least 2 per year to maintain its edge. So what happens when a country like Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, decides to push the envelope? The US has a few options, none of them good. It could launch a limited military strike, but that risks escalating into a broader conflict. It could impose more sanctions, but Venezuela's economy is already on life support, and Maduro has shown he's willing to let his people starve if it means staying in power. It could try to rally regional allies, but Latin America is more divided than ever. Brazil, under Lula, has been cozying up to China. Mexico, under AMLO, has been openly defiant of US pressure. And Colombia, once a stalwart US partner, is now led by Gustavo Petro, a leftist who has called for a new era in Latin American relations, one that doesn't include Washington at the center. This is the nightmare scenario for US. A regional crisis where America's traditional allies are either unwilling or unable to help, and where its adversaries see an opportunity to humiliate the US without fear of consequences. And it's not just Venezuela. Nicaragua, under Daniel Ortega, has been flirting with Russia and Iran. Cuba, despite its economic struggles, remains a thorn in Washington's side. Even Bolivia, under Luis Arce, has been deepening ties with Beijing. The US is losing its grip on its own hemisphere, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Let's talk about Russia for a moment, because this isn't just about Venezuela acting alone. Moscow has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, and the seizure of the Essequibo venture is almost certainly a coordinated move. In 2023, Russia delivered advanced S-300 air defense systems to Venezuela, a clear signal that it sees the country as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. Russian military advisors have been spotted in Nicaragua, and Moscow has been courting Bolivia with offers of nuclear technology and arms deals. Meanwhile, China has been pouring money into the region, investing in ports, mines, and infrastructure projects that could one day serve as dual-use facilities for military operations. The US has been slow to recognize the scale of this challenge. The last time Washington took Latin America seriously was during the Cold War, when the region was a battleground for ideological supremacy. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US shifted its focus to the Middle East, and Latin America fell off the priority list. That was a mistake. Because while the US was busy fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China and Russia were quietly rebuilding their influence in America's backyard. Now, the US is playing catch-up, and it's not clear if it can win. The Biden administration has tried to re-engage with the region, but its efforts have been half-hearted at best. The Summit of the Americas in 2022 was a diplomatic disaster, with key leaders like AMLO and Petro skipping the event in protest. The US has also struggled to counter China's economic influence. In 2023, China became the largest trading partner for most of Latin America, surpassing the US in countries like Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And while the US has been focused on countering China in the Indo-Pacific, Beijing has been quietly consolidating its position in the Western Hemisphere. So where does that leave us? The US is facing a resurgent Russia, a rising China, a divided Latin America, and a military that's stretched thinner than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And yet, the establishment in Washington still acts as if the US can afford to ignore these challenges. They talk about great power competition as if it's a distant threat, not a present reality. They cling to the idea that America's dominance is inevitable, that the world will always bend to its will. But history doesn't work that way. Empires rise and fall, and the signs of decline are often visible long before the collapse. Here's what I think is going to happen, and the US will demand the release of the Essequibo Venture's crew, and Venezuela will drag its feet, hoping to extract concessions. The US will impose more sanctions, but they won't work because Venezuela's economy is already in shambles. Russia and China will offer support, both diplomatically and militarily, to show that they stand by their ally. And the US will be left with a back down and look weak, or escalate and risk a wider conflict. Neither option is good. But if I had to bet, I'd say the US will choose the path of least resistance. It will issue strong statements, maybe even conduct a show of force, but it won't go to war over a single ship. And that's the problem. Because every time the US backs down, every time it fails to enforce its red lines, it emboldens its adversaries. And one day, those adversaries will push too far, and the US will have to respond or risk losing everything. This is the Thucydides trap in action. The US is the dominant power, but it's being challenged by rising powers that see an opportunity to reshape the global order. And the more the US tries to cling to its dominance, the more it risks provoking the very conflict it's trying to avoid. The only way out is to accept that the world is changing and adapt accordingly. That means engaging with adversaries, not just confronting them. It means rebuilding alliances, not just demanding loyalty. And it means recognizing that America's strength lies not just in its military, but in its ability to lead through example. But that's not the path Washington is on. Instead, it's doubling down on a strategy that's already failed: sanctions, military posturing, and diplomatic isolation. And as long as that's the case, incidents like the seizure of the Essequibo venture will only become more common. Because the world is watching, and it's learning that America's bark is worse than its bite. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just about Venezuela's recklessness or America's hesitation, it's also about the internal fractures in Caracas that make Maduro's regime both dangerous and brittle. The seizure of the Essequibo venture wasn't just a foreign policy miscalculation, it was a domestic political gamble, and one that could backfire spectacularly. Let me explain why this matters. Nicolas Maduro is not a strongman in the mold of Chavez. He's a survivor, clinging to power through a combination of repression, economic manipulation, and sheer luck. His approval ratings have hovered below 20% for years, according to data analysis polls, and the opposition, despite being fractured and persecuted, still commands significant support. The 2024 presidential election, which Maduro is almost certain to rig, is a ticking time bomb. The regime knows it can't win fairly, so it's doubling down on nationalism, distraction, and manufactured crises to rally the base. That's where the Essequibo venture comes in. The timing wasn't random. Just days before the seizure, Maduro's government had launched a new propaganda campaign around the Essequibo dispute, complete with maps showing the territory as Venezuelan and a referendum that overwhelmingly, if suspiciously, supported annexation. The message was Venezuela is under siege, and only Maduro can defend its sovereignty. It's a classic authoritarian playbook: create an external enemy to justify internal repression. But here's the uncomfortable: it might not work this time. For one thing, the Venezuelan military is not the monolithic force it once was. Desertions have spiked, with over 10,000 soldiers fleeing the country since 2016, according to the Venezuelan Observatory of Violence. The ones who remain are often more concerned with smuggling and corruption than with defending the revolution. And while the high command is still loyal, thanks to lucrative oil contracts and drug trafficking routes, the rank and file are demoralized. If the US were to impose targeted sanctions on military leaders or freeze their assets, the cracks could widen quickly. Then there's the economy. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, inflation is still in the triple digits, and the bolivar is so worthless that people use it as kindling. The regime has survived by dollarizing parts of the economy and relying on gold and oil smuggling, but that's not sustainable. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has already sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan officials and entities, and the Biden administration has shown no appetite for lifting them. If Washington tightens the screws, say, by sanctioning the state oil company PDVSA's remaining buyers, Maduro's ability to pay off the military and elites could evaporate. Here's the scenario: Maduro releases the Essequibo venture crew after a few weeks, claiming victory in the face of U.S. aggression. He uses the incident to justify a crackdown on the opposition, arresting more dissidents and tightening control over the media. But the economy continues to deteriorate, and the military's loyalty becomes more transactional. Meanwhile, the US and its allies, particularly Colombia and Brazil, start quietly engaging with disgruntled officers, offering amnesty and financial incentives in exchange for a transition. It's a long shot, but it's the only way this ends without a full-blown collapse. The alternative is far worse. If Maduro digs in, refusing to release the crew or back down, the US could impose a naval blockade, a move that would cripple Venezuela's already struggling oil exports. That would trigger a humanitarian catastrophe, with food and medicine shortages worsening overnight. The regime would respond with even more repression, but the international community, even Russia and China, would start distancing itself. Beijing, in particular, has no interest in being dragged into a conflict over a country that can't even pay its debts. And Moscow, while happy to poke the US in the eye, has its hands full with Ukraine. Let me be, Venezuela is not Cuba. It's not North Korea. It's a failed state with a collapsing infrastructure, a starving population, and a regime that's running out of options. The Essequibo venture incident is just the latest symptom of a deeper rot. The question isn't whether Maduro's government will fall, it's when, and how much damage it will do on the way down. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a manageable problem, a sideshow to bigger geopolitical struggles. But that's a dangerous miscalculation. A desperate regime is a dangerous one, and Maduro has already shown he's willing to take reckless risks to stay in power. The US can't afford to ignore this. Every time it backs down, it emboldens not just Venezuela, but every authoritarian leader watching from Moscow to Tehran to Pyongyang. The real nightmare isn't that Venezuela targeted the wrong ship. It's that the US might be the one steering into the wrong crisis. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of the entire post-Cold War security architecture in Latin America. The US has spent decades treating the region as a secondary theater, a place where great power competition could be managed with occasional military exercises and the occasional DEA raid. But that era is over. The Essequibo incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because the US has allowed a power vacuum to form, and Maduro, like every other autocrat in history, is exploiting it. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The US Navy's presence in the Caribbean has been a given since the Monroe Doctrine, but that presence is no longer unchallenged. Russia has been extending its footprint in Venezuela for years, with regular military flights, Wagner Group operatives, and even the deployment of nuclear-capable bombers in 2018. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, with Beijing now holding over $60 billion in Venezuelan debt, much of it collateralized against future oil shipments. The US can't just snap its fingers and expect these actors to back off. They've already made their bets. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent strategy for Venezuela because it never really had one for Latin America. The last time Washington treated the region as a priority was during the Cold War, when the threat of Soviet-backed revolutions forced a level of engagement that's been absent ever since. Since the 1990s, the US has oscillated between neglect and half-hearted interventions: Plan Colombia in the early 2000s, the failed coup against Chavez in 2002, the Obama administration's cautious engagement, and Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which only succeeded in pushing Maduro closer to Moscow and Beijing. None of it worked because none of it was sustained. So what are the alternatives? The first is the path of least containment. The US could double down on sanctions, tighten the naval cordon around Venezuela, and wait for the regime to collapse under its own weight. But that's a gamble. History shows that sanctions alone rarely topple regimes; in fact, they often strengthen them by giving autocrats a scapegoat. Look at Cuba, Iran, or North Korea. The US has been sanctioning these countries for decades, and they're still standing. The difference with Venezuela is that it's already a failed state. Sanctions might accelerate the collapse, but they could also trigger a mass exodus that destabilizes Colombia, Brazil, and the entire region. The US would then face an impossible: let millions of Venezuelans flood into neighboring countries, or intervene to stabilize the situation, exactly the kind of quagmire Washington has spent the last 20 years trying to avoid. The second alternative is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: negotiation. Not with Maduro, he's too far gone, but with the military and the business elite that still props up the regime. This isn't about rewarding a dictator, it's about recognizing reality. The US has already done this before, most notably in 1989 with AMA, when it removed Noriega after years of sanctions and covert operations failed. The difference is that AMA was a small country with a weak military. Venezuela is larger, more populous, and far more integrated into the global criminal economy. Any negotiation would have to include guarantees for the military's economic interests, particularly in the oil sector, and a clear path to amnesty for key figures. It's messy, it's morally fraught, but it's the only way to avoid a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. The third option is the one that keeps me up at escalation. If the US decides that Maduro's provocation can't go unanswered, it could respond with a limited military strike targeting Venezuelan naval assets, oil infrastructure, or even regime leadership. The problem is that this plays right into Maduro's hands. He's already framing the Essequibo incident as an act of resistance against US imperialism. A military strike would give him the martyrdom narrative he needs to rally support, both domestically and internationally. It would also risk dragging in Russia and China, neither of which would sit idly by while the US bombs a client state. And let's not forget that Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a NATO partner. Any conflict that spills over could force the US to intervene directly, turning a regional crisis into a global one. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome is a slow-motion collapse, where Maduro's regime limps along for another few years, propped up by Russia and China, while the US and its allies try to manage the fallout. The economy will continue to deteriorate, the military will fracture, and the country will descend further into chaos. At some point, the US will have to intervene to prevent a total meltdown, or accept that Venezuela is no longer a functional state and focus on containing the spillover. Neither option is appealing, but the longer Washington waits, the worse the choices become. Let me be, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of US leadership in the Western Hemisphere. If the US can't handle a crisis in its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to manage competition with China and Russia on a global scale? The Essequibo incident is a wake-up call, but Washington has a habit of hitting the snooze button. The question is whether this time, the alarm will be loud enough to force action. The real nightmare isn't that Venezuela targeted the wrong ship. It's that the US might not realize it's already in the middle of a storm and the lifeboats are running out.